And to be fair, it's not that you're saying that Muslims can't be racist, that Muslims have never been racist, that Islam has no race problem, obviously. What you're suggesting is that Islam has a structure in place, or at least should ideally have a structure in place. It's to address that, right? And I think the point of contrast is that if you look at capitalism, if you look at the way the U.S. is set up, even if you got rid of mass incarceration, if you got rid of, the history of what's happened with black people, in terms of, everything else, if you have a community that's experienced trauma like slavery, right, that was a racialized form of control over black people, even if at the point of emancipation no other racist law existed, there was no segregation, there was no Jim Crow, there was no mass incarceration, it still wouldn't be enough to bring those two bodies of people together. It still wouldn't be enough to bring black people and white people together.
Right.
You would still need something like what is mandated by Islam to actually have federally mandated actions that are supposed to break down racism. But in a capitalist system, that would be seen as an attack on individualism. That would be seen as an attack on property, on wealth distribution. It would be called a wealth distribution program. It would be seen as something that was totally antithetical. In fact, people like Cornel West and people who've been fighting the civil rights struggle for a long time, one of their big problems is that it is so hard to write a law that says the word black. In the sense that you can't create laws that are focused on trying to repair trauma for particular communities.
Right.
When laws, if they were written in the time of the Prophet, would have said Ansar, would have said Muhajirin, would have acknowledged that these were different groups that have different histories that need to be brought together. When you can't even create laws like that, because that's seen as somehow being racist, which is the height of irony, I think that's what kind of creates a much bigger problem.
What I would add is that Islam as a system and as a way of life doesn't have a race problem. Like, it actively works to break down the race problem. Yeah, Muslims might be racist.
Yeah.
And I think that it's important, like, again, going back to why is that the case? Where did this racism come from, right? You have on the one hand where, you had, like, when Islam was, where, you have, like, this mixing of races and things like that. Look at you and me, like, we're from, we're from the same area and we look very different, so we must have very different ancestry, right?
Yeah.
And that, like, people in the north of Pakistan, like, they're, like, have blue eyes and blonde hair, right, and red hair and stuff like that. So it's like you can see this mixing of race, and that race concept is not there in terms of, to a large extent, but when you see, for example, you see like Arabs mistreating South Asians or other people, or even classically the rift between the Arabs and the Turks, where did that come from, right? And it comes from colonialism, right? And it comes back to the system. It goes back to the system when we've been talking about the oppression of African Americans. However, when we look at these systems with these kind of problems within Muslims, we look and first recognize that Islam solves these problems decisively and has decisively solved these problems for centuries.
Sure.
Right, if not millennia. And then when you see it now and you kind of again allocate it to the individual, it is again the problem of the blinders going on, right? That the point is that these issues come from a structural point of anyone knows that the mantra of colonialism is divide and conquer.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
What that means, divide and conquer, meaning that way you split up the groups based on artificial divisions.
Like ethnicity.
To create those kind of rivalries. So racism was actively injected into the Muslim world by the colonial powers to enable them to control us. And that is what divide and conquer means. And that's when we see it, we should of course that we shouldn't hold those attitudes, and we should encourage anyone around us not to hold those attitudes, but recognize that these attitudes emanate from something other than Islam, and it emanates from the European and the capitalist approach of dealing with people.
And so even when you're talking about racism or any other problem that's taking place in the Ummah, whether it be Syria, whether it be Iraq, whether it be the subcontinent, I guess the solutions that we're supposed to be articulating are supposed to then again be systemic as well. You can talk all day about ignorance, lack of education, prejudiced behavior in the Muslim world, and people do. People love talking about these things. The treatment of women in certain cultures that are more tribal and more honor based, things like that. But really, what you have there is a weakening of the Islamic collective solution, which is why these problems can run rampant. Now, whether they're introduced by colonialism or introduced by local culture or whatever,
right.
The main point is that you don't have that regulating structure of Islam to actively address it the way that Rasulullah Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam addressed it in Medina. And so it just rears its head again.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's the point, is that when we have to, it's a tough thing. It's a tough thing because it requires, as we've discussed, it requires collective action to take on such tasks in the Muslim world, right? And to build these structures is not something that can be done on an individual level, and so it's difficult, right?
Yeah.
And it requires you calling a people out that might not like you calling them out, right?
Yeah.
And even if you, for example, look at sort of the policies that are implemented in the Gulf and other areas of discrimination, that has to happen at a policy level. I know a brother who was Egyptian, working in one of the Gulf countries, who had an Egyptian passport. When he got a Canadian passport, his salary went up.
Yeah.
Right? That's a policy thing. That's not that, we talk about,
That's systemic.
Yeah, and we talk about, in the North American context, equal work, equal pay. But something even as basic as that, they have race-based or passport-based, which is, it's a euphemism for race.
Yeah.
Is that's
pay
how
structures,
pay structures are based on that.
Yeah.
And so no amount of me, if I pray a million rak'ah of prayer, it's not going to change that policy, right? It's not going to change it unless we actively work to challenge that as a movement, right?
Sure. So I guess a takeaway for our audience, and Jazakallah khair for listening, would be that to hold ourselves to a higher standard as Muslims, and hold our leaders to a tougher standard, right? Let's not let them get away with what Abdul Qadir was talking about, of just getting on that pulpit and telling you nice things to do that you should be doing anyway. Hold them to a standard of being able to recognize systemic problems and form collective solutions. And it's really interesting because as Muslims, we sometimes feel that we aren't affected by these issues. We're somehow, safe from, the race problems, and safe from, it's okay for us not to talk about it because they're not really Muslim issues. But I just want to reiterate once again the centrality of, of standing up for the oppressed as an Islamic principle, the closeness that we share with many of these oppressed communities. The Black community being primarily one, which Muslims have always felt an affinity to in North America, and beyond that, just it affects all of us. It's that whole question of who are they going to come for next, right? If they could create a system of control around Black people and get people to just internalize it, how difficult is it for them to do that around Islam? How difficult is it for them to do that around the particular ethnicity you might be, whether it be South Asian or any other Arab or whichever ethnicity you might be that may not be Black? And so Jazakallah khair once again for listening, and like, subscribe, and do everything you can on all the YouTubes. Jazakallah khair.